What's up, y'all? If you like our content and want to support the channel, please consider signing up for our Patreon. For just $2.99 a month, you will help us create more content, enhance production quality, and engage with only the best history experts. Join us in preserving and celebrating the rich tapestry of American history. Your contribution makes a significant difference. Link is in the description. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to American History Gazette. I'm Jake Suggs, and today we are joined by John Legg. John is a Ph.D. candidate at George Mason University. His research is centered around Indigenous studies with a focus on the US-Dakota War of 1862. John, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Now, the removal, persecution, and genocide of the Native Americans throughout the 19th century is a tragic stain on America. And the Dakota War of 1862 was a rather large stepping stone for the U.S. government and their Indian removal policy. But leading up to that, they had a series of treaties between the U.S. government and the Dakota people that were passed throughout the early and mid 1800s. So, can you describe the conditions of these treaties and how they kind of laid the groundwork for distrust and animosity between the Dakota people and the U.S. government?
Sure. So before I really dive into that question, I should just briefly say that Dakota people live in what they call Minnesota Makoche, which is the Dakota word for land where the water is so clear that it reflects the sky. This is their homeland and encompasses much of the space we know today as Minnesota, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Iowa, North and South Dakota, and the Canadian provinces of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So this large space is the Dakota homeland, and for many generations, they're moving all over this place to connect with their relatives, to engage in diplomacy and trade and various other networks. And so it's really in the 1600s that we start to see European contact with the Dakota. And from that moment on, they start engaging with various colonial forces, pretty much the French and eventually the British and the Americans. And so by the 19th century, Dakota people, as Minnesota becomes a U.S. state, they're really competing for land, um, especially in Minnesota, which is kind of the center of Minnesota Makoche. Um, and I think when we think of the coming of the US-Dakota War of 1862, um, two treaties really stand out in forming this relationship with the federal government. And that's in 1851 with the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux and the Treaty of Mendota, which are basically um, the same thing, just signed with different bands of Dakota people, but they're both signed in 1851. And basically, what these treaties stipulate is the Dakota people agree to sign and cede over millions of acres of their homeland in Minnesota for the sum of about $400,000. And then they live on reservation lands along the Minnesota River, which is in south central Minnesota. And so these reservations form, and by 1858, the Dakota are pushed to only one side of the Minnesota River instead of living on both sides. And so we see through the 1850s and leading into the 1860s that Dakota people really are facing this kind of like shrinking of their place in Minnesota. Um, and as more white settlers kind of move into the area, they're competing for food that is dwindling. Um, and also, one of the really divisive factors of these 1851 treaties is Dakota people start to enter this period of starvation because of the lack of food. And also, as we get closer to 1862 with the Civil War, steering the government's attention away from these agreements, The Dakota people aren't getting these annuity payments that they were promised every year with this $400,000. Every, I think, June or July, they would get this lump sum payment for the year. And so they start to accrue debt with white traders in Minnesota, and they basically are starving because as the Dakota people don't have money to pay these debts, the traders start to not give them food or credit. And in these treaties, there's kind of this hidden stipulation that kind of tricks the Dakota into signing this, where the government agrees that they would first pay these annuities straight to the white traders and the Indian agents rather than directly to the Dakota people themselves. So as these debts start to accrue in the 1850s and 60s, it's becoming a very dire situation where Dakota people are not kind of getting the supplies and the food that they need. So it's really these, couple treaties in the 1850s that really set the stage, I think, for the US-Dakota War.
Yeah, the US government under these treaties was saying, "Hey, give us your land. In exchange, we'll give you money and annuity payments and we'll provide food for you. You guys won't have to worry about food. Give us your land in exchange for money basically." But the Civil War and other matters kind of caused the US to fall back on their annuity payments. So the Dakota people weren't receiving the money and food that they were promised. And at the same time, the government was pushing for Western settlement and westward expansion. And this also kind of squeezed the Dakota people into just a small strip, a reservation along the Minnesota River. And this really leads to, like you said, the starvation and kind of a desperate situation within the Dakota people. So this eventually forces them to play a desperate hand, and they're forced to raid nearby settlements for food. So can you just describe why were the Dakota people forced to raid settlements in search for food, and how did that ignite this conflict?
The relationship between Dakota people and the white settlers at this point is very complex. Dakota people are living on these reservations. They're trying to get food and supplies. And one of the most famous lines from the history of the US-Dakota War comes from the white Indian agent Andrew Myrick, who is kind of this intermediary force between the Dakota people and, you know, the government. And as Dakota people are requesting this additional assistance, he basically says something to the likes of, well, if they're that hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung. So it really kind of shapes this perspective of kind of how white people in Minnesota are thinking about the Dakota people at this time. They're not concerned about, their uh, ability to survive or to endure this experience. They're just, let them die, let them eat whatever they can from the natural earth. It's not our concern. And so this leads to um, a, a small faction of Dakota hunters. They come from the Metawanketon Band, which is one of the smaller bands of what's called the Santee Dakota. The Santee are the eastern band of Dakota people, and Metawanketon are primarily the ones that participate in the US-Dakota War. But I should add that all of the Dakota bands and its aftermath are implicated in the consequences of it. Um, but in late summer 1862, there's a small group of Metawanketon hunters that um, are in this state of starvation. And so they're foraging on white farms in Minnesota. And, there's a couple different stories out there, but the most popular one that I have heard the most is um, there was a bet made by these Dakota men where they wanted to kind of bet who could go get some eggs or something like that from this homestead. And when they did that, they encountered this white farmer and his family. Supposedly, they entered into a shooting competition when things turned dire and the Dakota weapons were turned on the family. Initially, the Dakota leader named Little Crow um, wanted nothing to do with war with the United States or with white people in Minnesota. Um, but after this moment, um, where basically all hell broke loose, um, the Little Crow decided to go to war with the white people in Minnesota. And initially, it's a conflict between white settlers and the Dakota people, and eventually the U.S. Army gets involved. But it's all sparked by this kind of like small, short, brief flashpoint at this white farm that kind of leads to the Dakota people entering the war, but also this like idea of vengeance and retribution by white people in Minnesota to kind of retaliate.
Yeah, at first it was just a small uprising, but the US government, with the policy at first of, like you said, to just basically let them die, let them figure it out. We're going to siphon them off and they can figure it out. But because of this uprising, they're forced to retaliate, like you said. And because they're occupied with the Civil War, they don't necessarily have the means to raise an army to combat this uprising. So they appoint a volunteer militia led by Henry Sibley. And that is the army that's dispatched to basically quell this conflict. You talked about Little Crow and Henry Sibley. They were basically the two leaders of the respective armies, I guess you would call it. So basically, who were these two guys and how are they leading their army?
I would say also that in the US-Dakota War, it wasn't only this collective Dakota force fighting against another force. There were a lot of individual bands and leadership that opposed the war or sided with it or joined in at various points. For example, the Sisseton Dakota, who, um, if we think about the treaties and the reservation lands along Minnesota River, basically those on the southern half are Metawanketon, and the upper are Sisseton. And so the people who lived in the upper reservation lands had a different relationship with the white people, and they actually opposed the war. But it was Little Crow and the Metawanketons and others who really kind of engaged in this conflict. And I would say a lot of the battles throughout the US-Dakota War are kind of quick, sparse, kind of fast moving. There's only a few instances where there's multiple attacks on one place. I'm thinking of the battles of New Ulm, um, where basically the whole town is kind of sieged by Dakota people. But there's kind of for 6 weeks there's these variety of attacks that take place throughout Minnesota, and it is Henry Sibley, who I should add has a really interesting history in Minnesota. He's a trader. He engages in the fur trade. He becomes influential in the state government. He leads this army against the Dakota in Minnesota. He also leads, after the US-Dakota War, one of the what's called punitive expeditions against Dakota people that fled Minnesota into Dakota Territory, North or South Dakota, today. And so Sibley plays this really important role. I'd also say um, with an interesting connection to the Civil War. There's a general by the name of John Pope, who is most famous for his failure during the Civil War at the Second Battle of Bull Run. He's one of these Union generals that are put in command of the Army of the Potomac, who is defeated by Robert E. Lee in the Confederacy. He's defeated and embarrassed, and one of the big things that the U.S. government did is when they wanted to replace one of these high caliber officers, they would pretty much send them to the West or send them to do some kind of duty elsewhere from the the prime theater of the war. And John Pope's one of these figures who is sent from Virginia in the Eastern Theater of the Civil War to Milwaukee, where he runs what's called the Department of the Northwest, um, with the prime goal of quelling this US-Dakota War. And it's really in this moment that you see a lot more military influence and strategy. Um, and, by the end of the 6 week period, we see a lot more military action between the Dakota and the U.S. Army. It basically ends with the Battle of Wood Lake, um, which is in September 1862. It's kind of where the Dakota force is kind of overwhelmed by the U.S. Army, um, and they basically are defeated in battle. Um, and so you have these various figures, whether indigenous or U.S. Army volunteer officers, or kind of these high echelon officers that have military training, fighting in the Civil War that come uh, west. You also have soldiers that are fighting in both the Civil War and the US-Dakota War. I find that aspect really interesting because there are a lot of historians out there that um, do not want to connect violence against Native Americans and conflict in the West, in the American West, with the traditional study of the Civil War. But I think the U.S.-Dakota War is a really interesting example to see how these two actually coalesce and come together. So there are, soldiers that fight at Vicksburg. Um, I think Pea Ridge in Arkansas, like a lot of trans-Mississippi Civil War battles that are also being sent up to Minnesota and the surrounding area to kind of fight the Dakota. And it shows that it's this like very, large scale kind of important moment in Civil War history. And it's all because of all these different competing figures that make it so interesting.
Yeah, it's no doubt that the Dakota War has kind of gotten a reputation of being a small, minor, 5 or 6 week conflict. But like you just said, it was definitely a large scale conflict. They were getting soldiers from the Civil War involved. But I want to backtrack a little bit. You talked about how the uprising was just a small band of Dakota people led by Little Crow. And you also said that there were a lot of other bands who were against the war. So I want to go into the consensus within the Dakota tribe concerning support for the war. Were most of them in favor, or it seems to me that most of them were against it?
Based on my research, it definitely seems like most were against the war. I mean, Little Crow, even at the start of it, was against it. I think he understood that um, understood the consequences of what could happen. Um, but like falling dominoes, that they were putting to this moment where it's like they have this momentum, and it really took Minnesota and the United States by surprise. Um, but I should say, so my dissertation research examines kind of the aftermath of the US-Dakota War and how Dakota people moved throughout their homeland outside of Minnesota. Um, and this tension over who fought in the war and who did not continues all the way through the 1860s and 70s and 80s. A lot of my research focuses on how Dakota people moved into Canada and how they used the US-Canadian border as this like strategic tool to protect themselves from the US Army. As I said earlier, there's a lot of vengeance and retribution by white people during this period. I mean, Minnesota approves um, civilians from collecting Dakota scalps. So basically, they're free to go kill Dakota people, scalp them, and turn them in for up to $200 per scalp. Like I said, there's these punitive expeditions where the Army is basically going after those who don't surrender and move away from Minnesota. Um, and so in all of that movement that I study, there's this tension of, who fought in the war, who didn't. Um, one example is there's a Sisseton Dakota leader named Standing Buffalo, um, who basically is forced to flee away from Minnesota after 1862. Let me add that this state government passes a law that basically allows for the removal of all Dakota people from the state and bars them from living in the state. And so these people who did not participate in the US-Dakota War um, are forced to flee as well, even though they played no role in it. And so Standing Buffalo and his Sissotans are moving throughout the northern Great Plains. They're going through what is now North Dakota, um, and they're facing off on Henry Sibley, who is pursuing them, who is attacking them, engaging in other battles. And Standing Buffalo is continually requesting for peace negotiations with Henry Sibley, and he's citing the fact that they did not fight in the US-Dakota War in Minnesota, and they should be allowed to make peace. And so there's a lot of interesting, tensions over that topic. I mean, the Metawanketon and other Dakota bands that fought in the US-Dakota War, um, they also moved west, um, and they're also facing this crisis of, do we say that we still support the war? Are we just trying to get through it? And so it's this really interesting point of showing that when we say the Dakota or the US-Dakota War, it was really only a war between certain people. It wasn't a collective Dakota nation, war. Um, you had mentioned the word uprising. I try to use the word war because in those treaties with the United States, they're signing these agreements, which is recognizing their sovereignty on this national scale. And so I see the US-Dakota War as a war because of that. It's two nations fighting against each other. But it wasn't the whole nation, it was these various smaller groups that either wanted to support it or did not.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a very unfortunate situation after the conclusion of the war. It all comes to a culmination at the Battle of Wood Lake where the Dakota people are defeated. And it's very unfortunate, and it takes even a darker turn from there because, like you said, only a couple bands were really fighting this war, but all of the Dakota nation was treated as adversaries in the conflict. And the U.S. government handles them with no remorse after the conclusion. So, after the defeat at the Battle of Wood Lake, how exactly did the U.S. government handle the Dakota people?
Yeah, so I think a good way to answer this is to say there's multiple parts to this story. So, first of all, you have Dakota people that surrender. So, after Wood Lake, there's a number of Dakota soldiers that understand the situation that they're living in, that they've been defeated, and they're being kind of recommended by their elders that they need to surrender, and if they surrender, things will go back to normal. And so there's a place called Camp Release. They named this Camp Release because Dakota people did have captives, white civilian captives. And so the agreement is that they would surrender and return any captives that they had. Um, and they're led to believe that when they surrender, they'll be able to go home. But that's not the case. So those who surrender, um, of the men that fought in the Dakota War, there's about 393. And Henry Sibley forms a military tribunal, and he's dead set on trying all of these men that participated in this war. There's a lot of what is called white victimhood, or scholars call this American innocence, where white people are kind of exaggerating the various incidents of the war. White people see themselves as victims and they see the Dakota as guilty. And so Henry Sibley and his military tribunal want to punish them for that. So at Camp Release, this military trial hears these cases, which on average were 2 minutes each. The Dakota people aren't given a translator. They don't know if they don't speak English, they don't know what's going on. Um, and the tribunal basically sentences 303 to death by execution. And because this is such a big number and such a big national moment, Abraham Lincoln hears word of the situation, and he determines he's going to review all of the court transcripts and make his decision because he realized that 303 people is a lot of people to execute. I mean, it's just unfathomable, you know. And so he reviews the cases and he determines that um, of the 303 sentenced to death, he was only going to choose those who committed sexual violence or something very heinous towards white civilians, which that number only came to, I think, two people. And Lincoln knew that that wasn't enough. He had to do something that sent a message to the Dakota people, but also sent a message to his white constituents that they would receive some type of retribution for what happened. And so, after continuing to review these documents with the staff, they chose 39 Dakota men who committed the worst crimes. Now, of course, these crimes I put in air quotes because there's not a lot of real evidence. They're going based on hearsay evidence or white testimony that says here he did this, I saw him do that, or whatnot. Um, and so on December 26, 1862, these 39 men are in Mankato, Minnesota. Eventually, one is reprieved because of this lack of evidence. So there's 38 men who are executed in Mankato, Minnesota. On one large hanging scaffold, if you can imagine a square, and on all four sides of the square, there's men just hanging. That's what happens the day after Christmas, 1862. It is still known as the largest mass execution in U.S. history, and it's still a very traumatic topic when you talk to Dakota people. So that's one side of the story. The other side is those who did not surrender at Camp Release. Those people, Little Crow included, his son, other important Dakota leaders and soldiers that fought in the war, and their families, because they're pushed away from Minnesota. They are fleeing west into what is now North and South Dakota. Um, and in 1863 and 64, the U.S. Army um, realizes that the Dakota people are still living close to Minnesota. They're living at a place called Minnewacan or Devil's Lake. Um, that's what it's called today, Devil's Lake. And they're still raiding into Minnesota. They're going on foraging parties. They're stealing horses, and they're kind of returning back to Dakota Territory, which is a space that's kind of uh, not that controlled. There's not a lot of governmental authority. It's a territory. It's not a state like Minnesota. And so the John Pope, the director of the Department of the Northwest, he organizes this punitive expedition that's led by Henry Sibley and also Alfred Sully. Alfred Sully is another general in the Civil War that has experience in fighting the Confederacy. He's also known for his ruthlessness against Indigenous people, which he has shown throughout his military career. Um, Ironically, he becomes the superintendent of Indian Affairs in Montana long after this. So it's just interesting how these military leaders played such an important role in handling Indian policy in the 19th century. Um, and so these expeditions, the goal is to basically it's like a pincer movement. Both Sully and Sibley's forces separate, and they're basically going to try and surround the Dakota people, bring them into confinement, and the goal is to punish the men and then contain everyone else who didn't participate in the war into prison camps and into confinement on reservations. Um, and so that's the other side of the story. There's these people that surrender, and there's the people who don't surrender. There's also a third part, and that's the people who didn't participate in the war, so women, children, elderly, who are also put in this very deadly, violent situation. And so immediately after camp release and kind of the um, new found authority in the region by the U.S. Army after the war. Um, the women and children and elderly and other men who didn't fight in the war, who were living in the lower reservation lands in Minnesota River Valley area. They're forced marched from their reservations to a place called Fort Snelling, which is in St. Paul. It's right at the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. Um, and this place, let me add, is sacred for the Dakota people. It's called Vidote. It's the center of their homeland. It has been for many generations. And so I'm sure it's not surprising to learn the Army placed a military post at this place to bring more control and authority in the region. And I think it attempts to strip that feeling of, sacredness away from Dakota people. And so the U.S. Army creates a uh, prison camp for the women and children and elderly. People call it a concentration camp. Um, and there's about 1,700 of them that are forced to live there throughout the winter of 1862 and 63. Many die, I think upwards of 350 people die from malnutrition, from disease, from sexual violence committed by U.S. Army soldiers. It's a very terrible situation. And they're placed there until the government can figure out another place for them to go. And so in spring 1863, these Dakota civilians are moved to the Crow Creek Reservation, which is in present-day South Dakota, um, and they're kind of settled there. Now, you may wonder, with the execution in Mankato, initially there was 393. They only executed 38. What happened to the difference of those men? Basically, Lincoln orders them to a place called Davenport, Iowa. There's a military training camp that's training soldiers for the Civil War. They create a prison camp for those men, and they're sentenced there for basically life. And so a lot of people celebrate Lincoln for saving these 265 Dakota men, but they're really placed in, horrendous prisoner experiences. And eventually, in 1865 or 66, Andrew Johnson, who takes over after Lincoln's assassination, he um, basically releases these Dakota men, and they go to this Crow Creek Reservation where their families are living. Um, and so here's like three just general stories of what happened to the Dakota people after 1862. Um, and like I said, my research is adding in this fourth story of Dakota people that um, are understanding what's happening in both Minnesota and Dakota Territory, and they decide to go north into Canada. And that's a really interesting story there too, because for the longest time, since the American Revolution and the War of 1812, Dakota people have had a strong relationship with the British. And in 1812, they actually joined the British on the attack of Fort Mackinac, which is in the Great Lakes. And they're basically awarded these peace medals for their participation in basically the first British victory of the War of 1812. And with these medals, they are promised protection for their lives. And so after 1862, when Dakota people go into Canada, they're wearing these peace medals and they're stating these promises that British made years ago, in which the British actually follow. So there's all of these complex stories of what happens to the Dakota, and I think it really contradicts, you brought up in your first question about Indian removal. When we think of the traditional history of the aftermath of the Dakota War, with the removal to camps and prisons and reservations. That's very typical for Indian removal. But we see kind of these stories of Dakota people choosing where they want to go, whether that be Dakota Territory or Canada, that kind of contradicts that narrative.
Yeah, I definitely want to emphasize that this was no small conflict. This, still to this day, is the largest mass execution in US history. And it's kind of coincidental that we're having this discussion today because the anniversary of it is, like you said, the day after Christmas. So that's only just a couple days away from today. And truly horrific. But one of the surprising things that I found when doing my research for this podcast episode and was horrified by was the concentration camps. And the condition within these camps were awful. Many people died, but it was kind of just a holding station to figure out where to relocate the Dakota people to. So after the war, you just explained very in depth that the Dakota people kind of spread out all over the place. They were, a nation that had their homeland, and after this war, just completely dispersed all over the place. And I'd like to really get into the Canada situation that you're doing your research on, because a lot of them did go to Canada under their own free will because they tried to have that shield of protection with the US Canada border. So, aside from the people that relocated to the Dakotas, which I would like to get into after, but for now, what was the situation with all of the Dakota people that relocated to Canada?
That's a great question. And I think I'll start first by saying that there was a lot less few who went to Canada than the rest of the story. Um, I study in my dissertation. At first, there's, only about 500 people or so that go from Minnesota and Dakota Territory into Canada. And they're led primarily by Metawanketon chiefs. Um, and let me also add that between 1862 and 1865, Dakota people are moving across many different borders. Like I said, they're going from Minnesota to Dakota Territory. They're going from Dakota Territory into Canada. Sometimes they're going back from Canada into the United States. They don't recognize these borders as these hardened things that they can't cross without permission. They just cross it whenever they want, for a variety of reasons. And so there are Dakota people who go to the border. There's a really prominent trading town called St. Joseph where Dakota people go and they meet with people who are called the Métis, which are kind of mixed ancestry people who have native and non-native ancestry. Um, and so they're their own kind of group in the story. But Dakota people are engaging with them. They're crossing the border. They're engaging with the British. But this group from Minnesota um, are led, that I really focus on, are initially led by these three Dakota chiefs, Little Six, Medicine Bottle, and the Leaf, and they lead these 500 or so Dakota people to uh, what's called Fort Garry. And Fort Garry is what we now know as Winnipeg, Manitoba. Fort Garry was initially at this time a Hudson's Bay Company uh, site of governance and political economy. Um, it's a important site for business and trade and negotiation. Um, at this time, this wasn't Manitoba, or part of Canada. It was part of what's called Rupert's Land. And Rupert's Land was a Hudson's Bay Company kind of space, that eventually becomes Canada in the 1870s, becomes Manitoba and Saskatchewan and other places. But at this time, the Dakota people under Little Six and Medicine Bottle and the Leaf go to Fort Garry and they're negotiating for a place in Canada because they recognize this as part of their homeland, as I opened this conversation with, but they also understand kind of the benefits of negotiating with the British. Um, there's a lot of contest between the British and the Americans at this time, and I think the Dakota people are trying to play that off of each other. Um, and so they spend the next 20 years negotiating their place. Um, and for this whole time, the Canadian government, or the British government rather, before it becomes Canada, they are citing that these are refugees from the United States. They were participants in the US-Dakota War. They called it the Minnesota Massacre in the documents. Um, but it's this interesting relationship where Dakota people, even though they're living in their homeland, have crossed these colonial borders and they're trying to negotiate their place in this Hudson's Bay Company area. And there's still Dakota people living there today, so they are very successful in that. But they use the border as a tool to protect them from the U.S. Army. And now let me add, there's this really interesting anecdote for Little Six and Medicine Bottle, these two Dakota chiefs. The U.S. Army understood that they were in this sovereign British territory, that they couldn't cross the border, and so they devised this kind of sinister and clandestine operation in 1864, where the U.S. Army officer um, who's stationed at Pembina, which is right at the border of Manitoba and North Dakota today, he hires some British civilians to basically lure these two chiefs into their home, and they get them drunk. They're giving them whiskey that's laced with laudanum, which is a derivative of opium. And once they're drunk, they place rags doused with chloroform over their mouths. They basically pass out. They attach them to dog sleds. And they transport them from Fort Garry area to Pembina. So it's about a 70-mile journey. This is like in the winter of 1864. So it's just crazy to think about. They're transporting over this winter landscape. Um, and the goal is by the government, the US government, that is, and these Canadian settlers that are trying to get Dakota people to leave, that if they kidnap these leaders and bring them back, then everyone else will follow. But that doesn't happen. So, the Little Six and Medicine Bottle kidnapping story adds this really interesting perspective of how the US government and Indian policy is not as straightforward. Uh, things kind of are blurry between the lines, and the governments will do whatever they can to again find this retribution to punish Dakota people. And so a year later, these Dakota chiefs are kind of moved from military fort to military fort. They end back up at Fort Snelling. They are put on trial, just like in 1862. There's a military tribunal, but they understand that there were some criticisms of that 1862 trial. Um, Again, there was no translators. There was no evidence, and so Little Six and Medicine Bottle faced like a 7-day tribunal. They're eventually found guilty for um, not crossing the border and evading the U.S. Army, but they were found guilty for events that happened in the US-Dakota War of 1862, and they're executed in 1865 in Fort Snelling. And so when you hear today Dakota 38 plus 2 as a form of remembering these events, you have the Dakota 38 from 1862, and then you have Little Six and Medicine Bottle from 1865. And so, one of my big points that I like to make is like the US Dakota War wasn't this blimp of time in 1862, but there was this long trajectory of events that happened over the 1860s throughout the rest of the Civil War that really shaped the Dakota experience in the United States and in Canada.
Man, that is truly cruel the way they treated Little Six and Medicine Bottle. I didn't know that when doing my research. That's horrific. But I want to try to get a lighter note here. You mentioned that the people who relocated to Canada in the long run, they were successful. They ended up being able to stay in Canada and carry on their tradition and their tribe as Dakota people.
Yeah, and this is a really interesting story and something that I'm trying to emphasize in my dissertation. So, when we think of in the United States, the kind of indigenous people being placed on reservations, it's almost done by force. They're the government's telling them where to go. It's often on lands that are not in their homeland or are even good places to live. That's the Crow Creek Reservation, for example. The Dakota people after 1862 are forced there, and they experience this very dire situation. But in Canada, what's interesting is the British give the Dakota this platform to negotiate. And so I talk about how Dakota people use diplomacy to find the sense of belonging in their homeland. And so, um, as I stated, this is like a British fur trade center. In the 1870s, Canada does something called Confederation. And so this is when the Canadian government, which is primarily in the east, in Quebec and Ontario and that area, they decide we want to grow this nation from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And so they figure out how to confederate all of this space. They purchase Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company, and they create these prairie provinces, they're called. So Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. Um, and basically, in that process, they have to figure out what to do with all of the indigenous people living there. And so they do these things called numbered treaties in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, where they're basically signing treaties with the indigenous groups there and kind of creating these zones of control and authority, and creating reserves. So in Canada, they call reservations reserves. Um, but what's interesting is the Dakota people are not included because they're not seen as Canadian Indians. They're seen as what the Canadians called foreign Indians, which is a really just interesting term to think about. How can you be foreign and native at the same time? But they also consider them refugees from the United States. So they're not recognizing the Dakota homeland as something that stretches both sides of the borders. They just see them as, oh, they came from Minnesota, they're from the United States. And so because of that, they don't sign these treaties. And to this day, they haven't signed any treaties with the Dakota people. So it's this kind of like blurring the line between uh, governmental authority, and living in their homeland that really complicates the story. And so, as I talk about in my dissertation, um, at many opportunities and many points of time over the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Dakota people negotiate for reserve space. So the Canadians, even though they don't sign treaties, they do figure out some sort of agreement that gives Dakota people land. And so a lot of the reserves that are in Canada today, one's called the Dakota Teepee Nation, there's the Oak River, there's Oak Lake, Sioux Valley. These are all reserves that Dakota people that initially came from Minnesota are living at today. Um, but unfortunately, there's a lot of separation between those Dakota people that are in Canada versus the United States. Um, there's this really interesting story of this Dakota man that he was giving an interview in the 1990s in a PBS documentary where he talks about he was on the Lower Sioux Reservation, which is in Minnesota. And I should add that eventually Dakota people do come back to Minnesota, and they do kind of relive on their homelands that they were first removed from. Um, he's living in this space and he sees people that are planning a trip to Canada. And he was like, why are they going to Canada? Did somebody from our community go up there for vacation or something? And they're like, no, our relatives have lived there since 1862. And he really had no idea that he had relatives that lived in Canada because the border over the course of the 19th and 20th century really hardened. You know, as we know today, you can't just drive over the border. You have to present your passport, you have to go through customs, like all of this crazy stuff, to just enter into Canada or return back. And so that whole system, this colonial system of control and authority over the region, really separated Dakota people. Um, so a lot of the history of the US-Dakota War and its aftermath does focus on like the story of returning back to Minnesota. You know, eventually Dakota people, these laws that are created to remove them, you know, are, you know, forgotten about, and they're allowed to come back and they settle and create these reservations in Minnesota. And that's kind of where the story ends. But my dissertation and research really shows how Dakota people in Canada continued to thrive. They lived up there. They continue to live up there today, and they're still vying for recognition. Just a few weeks ago, there's the Dakota Teepee Nation that is suing the Canadian government for something like $475 million because the Canadian government had built a military base on the land that's supposed to be theirs. And they're citing these 1812 promises that the British government gave them as evidence of like, this is our land, this is our relationship with you, and you kind of took advantage of that. So even through today, Dakota people are vying for this recognition and trying to, uh, you know, continue this culture and lifestyle in Canada. Um, that's just so fascinating.
Yeah, that is quite a fascinating story. It was a tragic event, and they faced a lot of hardships and adversities when they went to Canada. But it's good. It's good to hear that they ultimately thrived and were able to continue their lifestyle and culture, and the Dakota people were able to kind of come full circle back to their homeland. So despite all the tragedy, it's good to hear that. But I want to go back to the people that relocated to the Dakotas territory, what are North and South Dakota today. I'm just assuming here, but is that where the two states get their name from?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have a good answer, but it's something I need to look more into. But yeah, I think it's easy to assume that these states and territories got the name because this is Dakota homeland. Um, and I mean, Dakota people have long lived in this area. It's not just Dakota, there's other indigenous people that live throughout this region. Um, but it is a very sacred place for the Dakota people. And so, you know, after the US-Dakota War, there is a lot of movement into Dakota Territory, and these punitive expeditions really shaped that experience. Um, and as I said earlier, with this idea of retribution by the U.S. Army, there's several massacres that take place in Dakota Territory that are listed as battles. So the Army considers them to be battles, but in reality, they're straight up massacres of indigenous people. And what's interesting in the story of Dakota movement, there's a lot of like interesting ideas when you think of this idea of webs of kinship, which this historian Christina Hill has a book with this title where a lot of people are connected through these webs of kinship and family networks. And so Dakota people decide, of course, to move west because they understand it's more open than Minnesota. There's not much authority, but they know that they have a lot of family relations in that region. And this includes not just Dakota people. As I said earlier, the primary group involved in the US-Dakota War is the Santee, whether they fought or did not fight in the war. But to That's the Eastern Band. There's the Western Band, which includes the Yankton and the Yanktonai Dakota. Um, and there's Nakota, also known as the Assiniboine. There's also Lakota people. And so all of these people comprised what's called the Ocheti Shakoween or the Seven Council Fires. People also refer to it as the Sioux Nation. And so all of these people are connected through language and kinship and kind of these really interesting relations. And so Dakota people obviously understood that they had relatives and kin networks to the west where they could go to them for support and refuge. And that's what happens. Um, Dakota people joined Lakota camps. Uh, and unfortunately, in 1863, during one of these expeditions, the Army clashes with them at a place called Whitestone Hill, which is a really interesting place. I went there 2 years ago. It's basically in this really flat area. It's kind of rolling hills, but flat. And all of a sudden, there's like this kind of tall rise and a big lake next to it. And so Dakota people joined and lived with Lakota people at this place. And the Army, I believe it was Alfred Sully's expeditionary force, um, clashed with them there. Many of the people did not fight in the US-Dakota War, and the Army didn't care. They quickly, basically, assaulted this group. A lot of the men weren't there to fight, and it ended in upwards of 150 to 300 people dying. Um, in addition, Sully's forces um, used what Civil War historians call hard war tactics. So it's kind of like total war tactics against the Dakota people, where they basically threw and destroyed all of their camping and living equipment. They threw it in the lake next to the hill. They also, these indigenous people had upwards of 400,000 pounds of dried bison meat that they had been collecting and preserving and preparing for the winter. And the army soldiers set that aflame, and it was burning so hot that it created a river of molten fat that basically rushed down the side of this hill. Um, and so the goal was to, you know, destroy any opportunity for these indigenous people to survive. Sully didn't care that many of them had no experience or participation in the Minnesota War. It was just this larger emphasis on Indian policy of bringing more authority into the region and punishing indigenous people for being indigenous. And so there's many other moments like this in Dakota Territory throughout the 1860s, and I think it really sets the stage for what's to come in the region, um, which will, is a major focus of U.S. history when we think of Lakota interactions with the U.S. Army at Little Bighorn or Wounded Knee. Um, a lot of this violence is initially sparked in the 1860s after the U.S.-Dakota War.
Indian removal and the way that the Native Americans were forced from their land is just such a tragic stain on America. And the way that they did that, the ruthlessness, no mercy, no remorse, it's hard to fathom. And I couldn't imagine being there and partaking in that, or being a Native American and having that done to you and your people that have been there for hundreds of years. But fast forward to today, there has been kind of a recognition by the U.S. government of what they did. And in August of 2012, the governor of Minnesota, Mark Dayton, he declared it. He declared August 17th a day of remembrance and reconciliation. So there has been an effort to kind of reconcile with the Native Americans and apologize for the way they were treated throughout the 19th century. So, what has been the lasting legacy of the Dakota War and kind of Indian removal as a whole?
My answer to this will come from my expertise in studying the memory of the Dakota 38 hanging in Mankato, Minnesota. And I think this local history provides good context for understanding the broader story. Um, so I should add that uh, for over the 20th century, there's a lot of contest over the memory of the Dakota War. There's a lot of monuments that get erected to celebrate kind of this idea of white victimhood, to celebrate the white people that had honorably defended their communities or sacrificed themselves for the greater good. Um, there's a lot of monuments in Minnesota that are just celebrating this victory over Dakota people. And for the longest time in Mankato, there was a monument that I call the Hanging Monument in my master's thesis. That all it said was, here were hanged 38 Sioux Indians, December 26, 1862. There wasn't any context, and the builders of this monument, who were veterans of the Dakota War, and the communities that lived through it, wanted to create a historical marker that set the tone of historical memory. Um, Eventually, over time, that monument's challenged. I talk about in my research in the 1870s, the American Indian movement, which is a political group of indigenous people that are protesting the wrongs of American society in terms of indigenous culture and kind of dealing with that. They are protesting the monument through public presentations, and shortly after the monument's removed, it's hidden. It's moved various places, and eventually at the turn of the 21st century, it's hidden from the public. There's speculation that it was put into a municipal parking lot and buried with sand. Some people say it was thrown into the river. Some people say it was destroyed, given to the Dakota people, but nobody really knows publicly where it is. Um, but after that, there's a lot of talk of reframing this memory to include Dakota perspectives. For the longest time, Dakota people have been absent, and I think that this relates to this idea of settler colonialism, which is this theoretical framework of understanding how um, non-native people erase and replace indigenous people. So if we think of Mankato as an example, they really center this memory on white experiences and their victory over Dakota people. But it's not until the 21st century, um, 20th and 21st century, that we see more uh, centering of indigenous voices. And so today there's Reconciliation Park, which is a place to honor the Dakota people. There's a large white bison made of granite stone that is very sacred to Dakota people. There's a large scroll monument that lists the names of the 38 Dakota men that were hanged in 1862. And every year they have a commemorative ride. So 38 Dakota people, I think mainly men, ride on horseback from one of the reservations in South Dakota to Mankato. Um, and it's a big grand affair. They arrive to the site of Reconciliation Park, which is pretty much the site of the hanging in 1862. Um, and they have these cultural ceremonies and items that they attach to the monuments as a way of showing their continued, memory and honoring of their past relatives that were sadly executed in that town. Um, and so that continues on every year. And we just see more and more recognition, especially in Minnesota, to kind of honor Dakota people and their perspectives. Um, Fort Snelling, for example, like I said earlier, sits on the center of Dakota homeland. Fort Snelling's now a historical site with the Minnesota Historical Society. And there were a lot of debates over the last few years of changing the name from Historic Fort Snelling to include something more inclusive of Dakota people. Um, and they tried to just adding simply historic Fort Snelling at Bedote to recognize the Dakota homeland. And a lot of conservative politicians really debated that and threatened funding to the Minnesota Historical Society. Um, and I don't think it actually followed through, and I'm not sure if that's the name now. I'd have to check. But there was a lot of debate over just the simple name that recognizes this as an indigenous place. Um, and so there's been a lot of conversations and debates and events that really show that the memory of the US-Dakota War still lingers. Just my own personal experience doing research in the area shows how problematic it can be. Usually when you're in the Twin Cities area, it's more inclusive. There's a lot more recognition of Indigenous people. But when you get to some of the more rural uh, small towns in farmland Minnesota, um, it can get problematic. And so I brought up New Ulm before. I've been there for research, and that town and their historical society, they try to offer a more inclusive view, but they've also often challenged kind of like inclusive memory because there's a lot of people that still live there that had ancestors from 1862 that died in battle or died some other way, um, and they would rather focus on that than be more inclusive of Dakota experiences. So they're kind of trapped in the past in these places. Um, but it's really interesting, not just in Minnesota, but how the memory of the Dakota War kind of lingers. Um, I'm in Cleveland, Ohio right now for the holidays, but me and my wife live in Galesburg, Illinois. That's kind of 45 minutes south of Davenport, Iowa, and she works at Knox College. And when we moved there, I was doing some research and I remembered that in Davenport there was this prison camp for the Dakota men that were not executed in 1862, and I wanted to go check it out. And unfortunately, there's just a small stone that says, here were imprisoned 265 Dakota men. There isn't much context on what happened to them afterwards or how Indigenous people, uh, you know, possibly look at that place as something to remember and honor in their own ways. So there's a lot more work to be done, but I think that there's a lot of effort that's ongoing that are trying to kind of reframe these historical memories and narratives to be more inclusive of the Dakota past. The Dakota people also, commemorate their past in their own ways too. Um, through their own cultural practice. And so one example in Mankato is there's something called the Mankato Wachepi, which is this powwow celebration in the town that brings in all of these Dakota people, but also other Indigenous people that want to celebrate at the powwow um, as a way to remember the Dakota 38. So they didn't need physical monuments to remember their lost ancestors, but they wanted to do so through their cultural practice of dancing and celebrating in their own way, remembering, the spirit of these people. Um, and it's every year, it's quite powerful. I've been to it. It's just an interesting way. But unfortunately, like I feel like there's still separation in Mankato from the non-native public. They just kind of see, oh, well, they're over there doing their thing. We'll do ours. So hopefully things continue to mend in that town and kind of come together. But I think reconciliation is a big term that you know, is the goal that they want to bring everyone together and remember this past in the most ethical and appropriate way. And they've been doing that for a long time. And um, in Mankato is Minnesota State University, and they're fighting over this to this day. There was a Lincoln monument in the college Centennial Union where there's food and coffee and stuff. And Lincoln ordered that execution of the Dakota 38, but this monument in the town where the execution happened did not have any context. They didn't describe Lincoln's role. It described him as this great emancipator, as this person who freed enslaved people, who helped lead the U.S. to victory in the Civil War through his politics. And it wasn't until recently that the university and a group of students and scholars uh, got together and they contextualized the monument. And now there's a whole exhibit in their library that shows that there's these competing narratives to Lincoln in that town.
That's kind of surprising to me that even up until the 21st century, there still wasn't a lot of remembrance from the Dakota perspective. And it took all the way until the 21st century to kind of bring in the Dakota perspective in that historical memory. But I am glad that the government is kind of finally coming to their senses and remembering not just what Americans went through, but what the Dakota people went through, and we're kind of erecting monuments and parks and things of that nature to remember what happened in the Dakota War and how horribly the Dakota people were treated. It's also cool to see how the Dakota people are remembering the events in their own way, like you said earlier, how they walk from or they ride horses from South Dakota all the way to Minnesota where the events took place, which is crazy to see. But I want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing your expertise. You really have quite an impressive in-depth knowledge on the subject, and I am quite enlightened. I think that this is a huge, important event in American history when it comes to the Native American genocide and the way they were treated. And especially if you live in Minnesota, I think it's really important to know and remember what took place in your home state. So thank you so much for coming on.
It's been a pleasure to talk. I'm so grateful. And if people want to learn more about me, my website's johnlegg.org.
Yeah, I'm absolutely going to link your work below because definitely need to check it out. I see you dabble in photography on there as well.
Yeah, I've for the last 12 years, I've been a wedding photographer and landscape photographer, and um, I have recently entered into the genre of book cover photography. I had a friend publish a Civil War history book, and they're using one of my photos from Gettysburg on there. So it's pretty cool to see how I can connect photography and history together.
No, yeah, that is very cool. I definitely urge you guys to check out his website. It'll be in the description. John, thank you again.
Thank you so much.